Welcome back. So we're talking about things different than absolute monarchy, and we looked at a constitutional monarchy in Sweden, a composite empire in the Ottoman Empire, another composite empire, the Holy Roman Empire, including its problem child state of Prussia-Brandenburg. And now we're going to move on to the Italian states. Just like the other countries where borders are a little different than modern day, Italy is actually in pieces in the 16 and 1700s. The bottom part of Italy is the Kingdom of Sicily. Sometimes that's called the Kingdom of Two Sicilies. And then there are a whole series of smallish city-states, tiny republics, little bitty kingdoms. And in the grand center out of Rome, territory run by the Pope, who during this time is not just a spiritual leader, but also a military and modern political leader in a way that we're not used to today. So all of these Italian states have their own distinct governments and personalities. And because of various historical circumstances, we do not yet have one Italian country. The little Italian states do fight with each other and occasionally take each other over. They're kind of frenemies with each other. And those borders shift pretty regularly, as well as some of the systems of government. So it wouldn't be unusual to see an area that's a republic taken over by the neighboring Grand Duke or something like this. So the Italian states have all types of little governments, but probably the most interesting government, I would say, during this entire time period of the 1600s and 1700s is the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, because it's really unique. Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth has what we sometimes call an elected monarchy for its government. Basically, there had been, shall we say, fertility problems in the Kingdom of Poland. And because they had scrambled to find an heir, in the 1300s, Poland merged with Lithuania in a marriage deal. This becomes Polish-Lithuania and a big, pretty prosperous country. In the early 1500s, when they once again have problems producing an heir in this royal family, what we're going to see happen is a revolutionary idea where they will use local regional assemblies called Sejms, S-E-J-M, Sejms, in order to elect, with both the major nobles and the little minor nobles, a new king. And the king will serve out his time. It will be a competent adult. And then instead of just immediately turning to the king's son, there will be a new election. Now, this is a male-dominated system. We do not have queens running Polish-Lithuania. But it's a system that produces, because both the mighty, rich, powerful nobles and the ones who have one kind of broken down castle, but they're just hanging on to that noble status, have a say in elections. Poland has a lot of freedoms that other areas don't, starting in the period of this elected monarchy. So from about 1569 to about 1770, a good period of 200 years or so, Poland is going to be a country noted for its strong education system, for relative freedom of speech and freedom of religion. It's going to be a military power. The famous symbol of its might during this period are its hussars, the winged warriors of its heavy infantry that you see in the images in the bottom. The heavy infantry moves very slowly with giant lances, or I said heavy infantry when I meant heavy cavalry. Good Lord. Heavy cavalry is in fact going to move very slowly on horseback with heavy lances, which means that when some of the soldiers start decorating themselves with wooden and feather wings, it's okay because they're moving sort of slow and steady in the background in military maneuvers anyhow. Can't believe I just called the cavalry infantry. Oi, it's early in the morning. However, they'll eventually move to parade armor with huge metal sets of feathers. Because the feathers break off, we don't have a ton of these sets of armor left. But they become a symbol of the sort of glory years of the Polish-Lithuanian military for many people. And calling the heavy cavalry hussars is something that still happens in some modern militaries. So they're holding off Swedish power, Russian power, Ottoman power, Austrian power, Prussian power. They're fighting a lot of people during these years. And Poland's doing quite well. That religious freedom means that a number of people come to Poland as a sort of refuge, either as persecuted intellectuals or religious groups who have been facing persecution, particularly Jewish individuals who settle in a number of communities in this area. But the system that is working so well begins to fall apart in the mid-1700s when all of a sudden we see the system encroached on by Poland's hungry neighbors. So we start to have people offering bribes to Polish nobles to appoint certain people king that will be sympathetic to neighboring countries, to Russia or to Austria or to the Ottomans. And outside interference in elections becomes a serious problem. The most famous example of this is in the 1730s. You'll see the disastrous rule of Augustus II, or Augustus the Strong. He's the man you see in this slide here with the sort of terrifying eyebrows. And Augustus the Strong is named for not just his incredible physical strength. He's one of these guys who bends fire pokers made out of metal with his bare hands and rips packs of cards in half for fun and for show. So he's very large, very strong man, but he's also named that because of his virility. He has more than 350 recorded illegitimate children. So he's actually a German elector of the German territory of Saxony, famous big spender, particularly on fine porcelain, which he develops in Dresden at the Meissen factory. And he just decides he wants to be king and bribes his way to the top of Polish Lithuania. Now, unfortunately, he's spending so much time with the ladies that he is not spending time running the military effectively, and in a giant war with Sweden, he screws up so badly that he is going to end up needing Russia to bail his troops out so he doesn't lose control of his own country. This is when Polish-Lithuania really starts to become a Russian puppet state. And it will continue to get worse and worse as the 1700s progress. Augustus' son takes over, and his son is even less competent. And after that, Stanislaus Poniatowski is going to be literally a Russian plant. By 1771, there's what we call the First Partition of Poland. Prussia, Austria, and Russia decide to split the outer regions of Poland in thirds and just take their territory. And Poland is forced to accept it. Again, a year later, they'll take even more territory, so that all that's left of Poland is the tiny city of Warsaw and some suburbs. By 1795, its neighbors swallowed up even that. There was no country of Poland or Lithuania left. This has given Poland, I think, probably a justifiable sense of paranoia, particularly considering this actually happened again to Poland in World War II, regarding its neighbors. And we'll see a number of Polish uprisings as they fight to create a country again. So elected monarchy worked for a while. We won't be able to talk about the Swiss Republic because we just have so many countries to cover. But we are going to talk about a republic in the Netherlands, the Dutch Republic. The Netherlands were controlled by Spain until 1648, when the Dutch had their independence after an 80-year war, which is freaking impressive. 80 years of warfare is serious long-term commitment. And the Dutch decide to create a republic. This is going to have a huge, strong middle class because anyone with a certain amount of property is allowed to vote. And the Dutch are notoriously good traders because their country is up on the coast. And they are going to create huge warehouses in cities like Rotterdam and Amsterdam, where they become the world's middlemen. It's like they're the early Amazon warehouses in these Dutch cities. And the more the merchants trade and vote, the more powerful they become. So there's a whole golden age of Dutch shipbuilding and Dutch art. And it becomes a very, very wealthy country. It creates a whole little empire, as you can see on the map, of what look like little dots. These dots are basically trading posts because the Dutch show up, they want to grab stuff, and they want to go. They don't necessarily want to leave huge groups of settlers in their colonies. Two exceptions are the tip of South Africa and over in Malaysia and Indonesia. That's because these areas are worth so much money. Tip of South Africa is an important point to snare trade from travelers sailing around the African coast. And those islands in Southeast Asia are known as the Spice Islands in Europe, and incredibly valuable resources. The Dutch have some seriously questionable decisions besides stripping people of resources. They'll be involved in the West African slave trade, like a number of other European powers, to their shame and discredit. But all of the money that they're making is going to create problems for them in addition to serious karma issues. The Dutch are going to find that being a tiny, super wealthy country makes everyone start looking at them with hungry eyes. They're famous for having an even more open society than the Poles. Not just religious freedom, but they're going to allow people to be legal atheists. They're going to sponsor all sorts of philosophers and scientists and wild free thinkers. They're going to have the most open publishing laws in Europe, the most freedom of speech. But what happens is they have this elected group government, a sort of parliament called the Estates General. And this open, everyone talks about things in the Estates General policy doesn't work so well when you're under military attack. There is no executive, no commander-in-chief, and they keep having to appoint a temporary one every time they're attacked by greedy neighbors. This commander-in-chief will be known as the stadtholder, and they finally decide to just make the stadtholder a constitutional monarch in the late 1700s because it's just too much work to have a stadtholder for a couple weeks, then get rid of him. The next time we're invaded, bring him back. The stadtholder had traditionally come from the noble House of Orange, and they will become constitutional kings that are around to the present day. So Republic doesn't last too long because way too many greedy neighbors getting involved during this period. Incidentally, if you're a football fan, this is why Dutch football supporters always look kind of like hopping traffic cones with their orange gear. The last country we're going to talk about a little bit is Britain. Britain famously has problems producing an heir under the Tudors. Henry VIII and all his wives, then his children, none of whom produce their own kids. Edward VI dies young. Bloody Mary is not able to have children with her husband, and Elizabeth never gets married. So as the Tudors leave the and early 1600s without an heir, the throne goes to their Stuart cousins. In the bottom picture, you will see, in red robes here, James I of England. In Scotland, they call him James VI because they'd had some James before. And he will be the first to officially combine England and Scotland under his rule, although they'll say have separate parliaments for another 100 years. James Stuart is famous for talking English and Scottish Parliament into letting him do basically whatever he wants. But he has a very stupid son named Charles I. Charles is the man you see in the left with the pointy beard, slightly smug look, and fabulously conditioned hair. Charles I is going to get his head cut off for fighting with Parliament about how to run the church in England, not showing up to talk about church and political issues in Scotland, and trying to pass taxes without Parliament's support. These civil wars in the early to mid 1600s end when his head is removed, and the leader of Parliament's armies, Oliver Cromwell, a man whose small picture you see right under Charles in armor, is going to be military dictator of Britain, England, Scotland, and parts of Ireland for about 12 years before he dies. During those 12 years, England is run by Parliament, and it's also run by devoutly religious individuals known as Puritans. It has strict moral laws, and after Cromwell's death, there's a lot of pressure to make England, Scotland, and Ireland a little more party-hardy and a little more royal, because no one knows how to replace a military dictator. He called himself Lord Protector, Oliver Cromwell. They decide it's time to go back to the old system, but they never want a king who ignores Parliament again. So, Parliament in England is going to send a letter to this man, who he really does look like Captain Hook, as a student of mine said a few years ago. This man with the long locks is Charles II of England. Charles II had not been doing well since his dad got his head cut off and he was chased out of England. Charles at this point was living a pretty sad life above a brothel in Breda in the Netherlands, without much funds and without much in the way of career plans. So what Charles II does is, when he gets a letter from Parliament saying, hey, we want you to be king, but you have to listen to us, you have to follow our religious rules, our tax rules, he says, fine, I'll follow whatever rules, I'll even get over the fact that you cut my dad's head off, just can you give me a job and some cash? This becomes the compromise that helps England, Scotland, and Ireland stay constitutional monarchies. Parliament will let him come be king in 1660, an occasion known as the Restoration of the Monarchy, but he promises to follow those rules. Later, his nieces who take power promise to follow rules in order to stay in power or to get the throne in the first place. The same thing happens to the distant cousin, George I of Hanover, who you see in the bottom corner. He comes along when there are no non-Catholic Protestant heirs to the throne. England does not want Catholics in charge. It's quite paranoid, in fact, about these other religions. So when they go for the German cousin of dead Queen Anne, they have a man who can't even speak the language. And he says, I'll do whatever you want. Just keep the paychecks rolling. This is how the British crown lost most of its actual power. And the power will get weaker and weaker until by the mid-1800s, with Queen Victoria it's a lot of standing and waving. Today, that's primarily the Queen's duty, to open buildings wearing little pastel suits and waving her hand at crowds. There are some government duties, but most of them are ceremonial. And that's how this became one of the most famous and longest lasting constitutional monarchies, in European history. If you have any questions, give me a shout. If there are governments we didn't cover that you're curious about, same thing. I had to leave a lot of info out to keep this from being an hour-long video. So feel free to communicate any concerns you've got. Hope all's going well.